Hello guys, with belongs to relationship, have you ever needed to query the data 2 levels above? For example, user belongs to a city and then city belongs to a state, and you need to query users by state 2 levels above. One of the solutions is to have intermediate field, so save the state directly in the users table, duplicating the data. In this video, I will show you an example of that with my experiment Is it actually faster and by how much, with two examples, with Filament admin panel and general Eloquent queries using whereas or join syntax. So let's explore all of that. And this is the second free YouTube video from my latest course, Structuring Databases in Laravel 11. So one of the lessons here is foreign keys to grandparent duplicate data, worth it or not worth it. And you can see the example of similar thing here on the left in the diagram. So I will link the full course in the description below. It's available for premium members of Laravel Daily. But today in this video, I will show you an example with users, cities, and states. So if we take a look at Eloquent model, user belongs to a city. And then if we click city, city belongs to a state. So it's a child, parent, grandparent relationship. But also we have user state. Now the question is how faster it is to query by city state versus directly by user state. It's obviously faster, but by how much? Let's take a look at the table example. Here I am in my Filament admin panel, and I've seeded 20,000 users. And the general queries, if we take a look at Laravel debug bar, I will zoom that in. It's select by users and then eager loading city and state to show the city and state columns. Now I've added a filter in Filament by state, and if we choose Alabama here, then it shows only Alabama state users, and the query is this. Select from users where exist state by ID, and here we're querying directly from users state ID. In the Filament resource, the code is this: text column state name and then filter with relationship state by name, which means direct relationship of user state. But we also can use a different relationship to level up user city state like this. And now if we refresh the users table and try to use the same filter, which will still work, so we choose Alabama and the query is longer. Select from user where exists cities and then where exists states. So we add another subquery of exists. So let's actually benchmark it. So 8 milliseconds. Let's try another state. 4 milliseconds. Arizona 3 milliseconds. Arkansas 6. So it's hard to measure precisely because the numbers are different, but from like 3 to 4 to 10 milliseconds. And we will also benchmark it with Laravel benchmark a bit later in this video in a few minutes. So we have this query, right? But now let's get back to user state, uncomment that one and see how fast it is. Refresh the page and let's filter Alabama again and let's see the speed. See 1.17 milliseconds. So it's not 3 or 4 or 10, it's 1. Alaska, 133, Arizona, even less than a millisecond. So you see the difference. It's pretty significant. And this is on 20,000 users with quite small amount of columns, and probably in more complicated relationships, the difference would be even more significant with more users visiting the website at the same time and putting more load on the database server. Now, by the way, I'm showing Filament admin panel here, assuming you're familiar with it, but if you're not, I have a special course, also one of the popular courses, Filament 3 from scratch, and I will link that in the description below if you want to create admin panels like this one. But I want to emphasize the SQL queries here. And speaking of SQL queries, let's take a look at another example outside of Filament. So based on the same database, I've created a separate user controller just querying the users by state ID 1, which is Alabama, and then showing the users in the blade, something like this. Just a simple for each, which looks like this. So list of users, name, city name, and state name. Nothing really fancy. And let's benchmark it with Laravel benchmark of how faster it is to query by city state versus by directly user state. And there are a few ways to accomplish that, and this is the code that I have here. Let's uncomment that. There's a benchmark function in Laravel, benchmark DD, where you can put an array of queries or operations. It doesn't have to be Eloquent or DB queries. So you put a name and then callback function with whatever you want, and Laravel will benchmark how fast it is. And you can put the amount of iterations. I've put 20 iterations for each of those queries. So the first query is, let's actually close the sidebar. First query is where has. So I'm using where has to query the city state. So that would be a typical query. Another typical query, again querying by city state, is with database join instead of where has. And this one is faster. And I have a separate video comparing where has and join and why you should probably use join in most cases. And I will link that video in the description below as well. And then the third option is to actually use where user state without joining the cities, without putting where has on city state ID. Instead, we're using user state ID. And let's see how faster is the third one comparing to the others. And here's the result in the browser. Let me zoom that in. So where has 6 milliseconds, 4 milliseconds, and user state is faster. Refresh again. Refresh again. The results are pretty stable. So user state is roughly 2 times faster than where has, and I guess 1 point something times faster, some percentage faster than join. So it's basically faster, but not like 10 times faster. Of course, it depends on your data and your structure, and you should benchmark and measure on your specific situation, but these are my numbers from 20,000 users in the database. Now, obviously, having that separate column and duplicating data, so user state ID duplicating the city state ID here, means 2 downsides, 2 things to consider. First is you have to ensure that the data is correct in both places. So if, for example, city changes to another state for whatever reason, you need to update it in all the users as well. And you can probably use Laravel observers for that, or even take care of that on database level, but in any way you need to ensure that. And there's also a downside of one more column in the database. So this one, which obviously takes a bit more space, and index on that also takes some space. But for integer field, or tiny integer in this case, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Still something to consider. So yeah, this is my mini experiment and benchmark on whether to have that direct grandfather, so to speak, field in the child column. What do you think? In your experience, is that field worth it, or would you query it with intermediate table all the time? And again, this lesson comes from my latest course on structuring databases in Laravel 11, so if you want to get all those 18 lessons, I will link that in the description below. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.